That's extremely good that we have established the contact with Phil Johnston. Welcome.
Well, it's good to be with you.
Likewise, we feel that it's an honor for us that you are with us tonight in this very special day for the United States, but not only for the United States and its citizens, but of course for the entire world. May I ask you a first question that comes back as I read also what is part of your background. And let's go and try to go to one of the key issues of the Obama presidency, and that has been one that has been extremely contested, which is the healthcare reform.
Yes.
Do you think that Obama actually went as far as he could with the healthcare reform, giving the context, giving the U.S. history, of course, the U.S. society, the U.S. economy, the feelings of the population? Could he have gone somewhat further? And what actually is still the unfinished business on this point, maybe? But also, what could change if, instead of a re-election of Obama, Mitt Romney would occupy the White House? Would he be able to unpack completely the reform of Obama, as he has stated that he apparently has stated that he would like to do, or that would not be the case? So can you say something about this very key issue in the U.S. electoral campaign and politics?
Sure. I think that to answer the second part of your question first, I think that if Mitt Romney were to win the election tonight, that Obamacare would be pretty much dead. And that would be, from my perspective, that would be a terrible tragedy, because many of us have worked for years here in the United States to try to do what most European countries did a long time ago, which is to guarantee that all of our citizens have access to high-quality, affordable health care. And so the Obama legislation is really transformational for the U.S. And, we have over 50 million people still in this country who do not have health insurance. The Obama health reform legislation will mean that about 30 million of the 50 million will get it. So it's a big deal, and I think that Obama went as far as he could politically. It's not a Scandinavian kind of model. That is, it's not a government program, despite what the right wing says. It's really a kind of program that's similar to the German system, and there are a number of other countries in Europe, Switzerland and Portugal. A number of other countries have similar health systems, and they've worked very, very well. So my sense is that if Obama is reelected, that legislation will be implemented, and it will make a huge difference to tens of millions of people here in this country.
I would also like to ask you, in one of your other capacities, which is, in my notes I read, of course, which I should have known, of course, before already, that you are a successful businessman. I would like to ask you your view on the American economy. Job creation has picked up slowly, not as fast as many would have hoped, except, of course, those that would hope for the worst in order to go somewhere else. But, of course, we all would hope, of course, that jobs would be created much faster than they actually do. We have also seen a debate, certainly in Europe, and I think also Obama has taken occasionally a position that actually Europe should stop actually reducing its spending, but should increase its spending in order to get the economy back on track. Clearly, this is a crisis which is lasting already very long, and the prediction is that it will still last very long. So, from your perspective, would the recipe, if we could call it very simplistically this way, of increasing public spending, would that alone help us out of the crisis? And would the venue that has been taken so far in Europe, and especially by Germany, in decreasing spending, what is the best recipe? And would that be just enough, more or less spending, or what else should be done to get the economy back on track?
Well, we have a phrase here in the United States called prime the pump, and that means that we're going to put public money into the economy in order to stimulate it. And Obama began that in his first year in office when the economy was really in terrible trouble here, and we were hemorrhaging jobs, and the deficits began to increase in the federal budget. And I would argue that and I know that Obama would argue that the stimulus program worked to some extent. And I think that my own view is that it wasn't enough, that we actually needed to prime the pump more than we did. And they felt that the Obama administration felt at the time that $750 billion was about all they could get through the Congress. It should have been probably in excess of $1 trillion. But, and you can see that happening now in Europe as well. The insistence on the part of Chancellor Merkel that there be austere budgets in many of the countries in Europe is having a negative impact on the European economy, and that's what would happen here as well, from my perspective at least. I think that Keynes was right, that it makes sense, at least over the short term, to stimulate the economy with public expenditures. That's been the Obama administration's position. Mitt Romney has a very different view. He believes that that's a mistake because it drives up deficits, and that that imperils the economy by itself. But I think that clearly if Obama is reelected, I think that there'll be more spending on infrastructure, more spending on education, at least over the short term. And then in fairly short order, I think that the Congress and the Obama administration will begin to deal with the federal deficit as well.
Thank you very much. As you probably know, this event that we have here this evening and tonight is part of a larger event in which we had yesterday and today's morning, we had a seminar for students from various top Italian universities, the Bocconi in Milan, the University of Florence, and the Lewis in Rome, as well as students from US universities that have programs here in Florence. And the students have been taking courses on a number of aspects, including the economy and human rights issues, international law, and so forth. So I was wondering whether any of the students would have a question for you concerning getting the economy back on track, or anything else that is related to what Phil Johnston just said. I see one hand raised, but we need to get a microphone. We need to get a microphone to the students over there. Yes, it's actually there are more hands, but she was first. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, so my name is Corinne. I'm also from Massachusetts, actually, but I go to Northwestern University in Chicago. So my question is...
Sorry, do you hear her?
Yes, I can hear her.
So my question is actually about healthcare. Do you view Obamacare as being based on the Massachusetts system? And then what do you think that means for Mitt Romney, since he's campaigned very hard on repealing Obamacare, which seems to be based on a system that he, in fact, voted for when he was governor of Massachusetts?
Yes, it's a really great question. And where are you from in Massachusetts, by the way?
I'm from Natick, Massachusetts.
Oh, good. I lived in Natick when I was a child, and spent a lot of time growing up at Wellesley also. You raised such an important point that many of us have talked about. I was very involved in getting the Massachusetts health reform legislation passed here a few years ago. And of course, Romney was governor at the time. Senator Kennedy was still with us, and he was very involved in the passage of that legislation as well. And of course, the point you make, which is that the Obama legislation is based almost exactly on the Massachusetts plan, is a very important point to make. because Romney, of course, helped to get that Massachusetts legislation through when he was governor, and then inexplicably he walked away from it while he was running for for president. And many of us have gotten kind of a laugh or two out of the hypocrisy involved in his doing that. And President Obama has raised that in debates repeatedly. And I think, frankly, that it hurt Romney because it made him look like he really wasn't being honest with the voters. So I think the point you make is a really important one. Thank you for doing it.
Is there anyone else of the students that has a question? Oh, I see now. We have two hands.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. My name is John Draxler, and I'm from Washington State. I wanted to ask you about Mitt Romney's campaign rhetoric. As you just mentioned, he's willing to say a lot of things to get into office, or at least that's a common perception of him. Do you think that when he's president, his ideology and his policies will be more liberal or more conservative from the rhetoric he's been using on this campaign?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that if he were left to his own devices, that he would be relatively moderate. When he was governor here in Massachusetts, he was relatively moderate. But I think there's a dynamic, a political dynamic that's happening in Washington now, in Washington, D.C., which complicates the outlook if Romney were to take the White House. And that is the Tea Party. You've got 80 plus members of the United States House of Representatives now who are extreme right-wingers, members of the Tea Party, and they dominate the Republican caucus in the Congress now. So I think that he would have to deal with them, and they would pull him to the right, as we saw during the primary season earlier this year when he was attempting to win the Republican nomination. So if I were betting, I would say that given the current entire political environment in Washington, that during the coming year, that he would almost be forced to have a relatively right-wing administration, which I believe would be extremely dangerous for our economy. And by the way, I think on the human rights front, and I know that, of course, being involved with the Robert Kennedy Center for so many years as I have been, I think human rights is very important. I think internationally that it's been very interesting that he never mentions human rights, never talks about the importance of respecting people in third world countries and the rights that they should have. And that's what our country should be all about, is protecting those rights, as Robert Kennedy tried to do. So I found that very troubling. So yeah, I think that he would be as right-wing a president as we've ever seen, or at least since Ronald Reagan.
I'm not sure whether we have time for another question.
Sure.
We are also waiting for, yes, they say yes. I would have another question that is actually just what you mentioned almost towards the end. Can you say a little bit more about your work with the Robert Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights? Because after all, we are organizing it, and it's, we all know it's a good organization, but we want to know more, and we want to get other persons to let it know. So can you say something about the organization and why you joined, and what you think are the strengths of the organization?
Well, Robert Kennedy was my great hero when I was a young man, and when I was in my early 20s, I worked in his campaign for the presidency. What happened with the assassination of Robert Kennedy was a terrible tragedy for the world, really, and certainly for the United States. And so I then, a group of us who had worked in his campaign founded an organization called the Robert F. Kennedy Action Corps, which helps, as all these years has helped children, you know, low-income children and children in foster care and juvenile offenders. And that's been a wonderful program. And so I was in the state government for a long time here in Massachusetts in the legislature, and then I was in Governor Dukakis's cabinet running health and human services. When I left state government in the early 90s, I was asked by the Kennedy family to run the what we then called the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial. And I did that for a number of years. And then I worked in the Clinton administration, and then I went back and became chairman of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, and I've been very involved on the board ever since. And I think that the organization, you know, I just tell you my background in that regard so that I'm one of many people who have been deeply involved with the Robert Kennedy Center because we were inspired by Robert Kennedy and what he represented, and we want to see his work carried out in terms of human rights internationally, and in terms of his emphasis on peace, not war, negotiation rather than weapons, and an emphasis as well on civil rights and an end to racial or discrimination based on race or gender or sexual preference or ethnicity. And also an emphasis on trying to do everything we can to reduce the level of poverty in our country and all countries around the world. So, of course, one organization can't do this by itself, but everybody has a role to play, and I think the Robert Kennedy Center has played a really significant role.
Thank you so much for your time with us, for your thoughts, for your input. We just very much enjoyed it. We now have to leave you because we are now moving on to another element, to another person working with the RFKC, which is John Heffernan, who will certainly speak about what the organization does and what is important, especially towards the younger persons in schools, mid-schools, high schools, and all kinds of educational programs. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao.